The royal convoy moved smoothly through the well-paved streets, its glossy black cars reflecting the warm glow of the evening. The prince sat in the back seat of the lead car, staring absent-mindedly out of the tinted window as the world passed him by. He had done this trip countless times before, driving through the wealthy district, past grand mansions, toward the outskirts where the lesser privileged lived. Yet, today, something caught his eye. A 20-year-old girl. She stood behind a beautiful iron gate, her fingers gripping the bars as she waved at his car. She wasn't just waving at him, she was waving at the entire convoy, her face lit up with an innocent, childlike excitement. Her brown skin gleamed in the fading sunlight, her large eyes filled with wonder, and her curly hair was tied back loosely, with stray strands escaping in the breeze. Prince Adrian blinked, momentarily taken aback. "Did you see that?" he asked, sitting up straighter. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "See what, Your Highness?" "The girl? The one behind the gate?" The driver barely reacted. "Ah, there are always children watching the royal convoy, Your Highness. It is not unusual." But Adrian knew this was different. There was something about the way she waved, not like a child greeting a prince, but like someone calling out to something unreachable, something she longed for but knew she could never have. He turned his head, trying to catch another glimpse of her as the car sped past, but she was already gone. Days later, as the prince's car glided down the same road, his gaze instinctively drifted to the gate, and there she was again. This time, she wasn't just waving, she was smiling, a soft, knowing smile, as if she had been expecting him. Prince Adrian felt an unfamiliar tug in his chest. He didn't know her, yet he found himself intrigued by the way she stood there, unafraid, looking directly at his moving car, as if she could see through the tinted windows. "Who is she?" he murmured. "Who?" "Your Highness," his guard, Victor, asked from the front seat. Adrian hesitated. He wasn't sure how to explain it, how to put into words the strange pull he felt whenever he saw her. "No one," he said at last, shaking his head. It became a pattern. Every time he passed that gate, she was there, waiting, watching, waving with excitement. By the fourth time, Adrian couldn't ignore it anymore. The curiosity was too strong. This wasn't just a coincidence. She knew he was passing, she was waiting for him. And it wasn't desperation in her eyes. It wasn't admiration either. It was something else, something deeper, something he couldn't name. Finally, on the fifth time, he couldn't take it any longer. "Stop the car." The command came so suddenly that the driver slammed the brakes in shock. The entire convoy screeched to a halt in the middle of the road. Victor turned sharply in his seat. "Your Highness, what?" But Adrian had already thrown the car door open and stepped out. The air outside was thick with the scent of dust and blooming flowers. The prince's polished shoes crunched against the gravel as he walked toward the gate, his heart pounding for reasons he couldn't understand. The girl was still there, her hands clutching the iron bars, her eyes wide as she realized he was coming toward her. For a split second, she seemed frozen in place. Then she ran. She turned on her heels and disappeared into the compound, her bare feet barely making a sound on the stone path. Adrian stopped in his tracks, staring after her in stunned silence. He had expected her to speak, to laugh, to stay. He hadn't expected her to flee. Victor jogged up behind him. "Your Highness, we should go. This isn't safe." Adrian ignored him. Instead, he turned to the gate man, an elderly man with graying hair and tired eyes. The man had been standing nearby, observing the exchange with quiet amusement. "Who is she?" Adrian asked. The gate man scratched his head. "The girl? Oh, she's just a maid, Your Highness. Just a maid." The words felt heavy in the air. Adrian's stomach twisted. For some reason, that answer didn't sit right with him. Just a maid. But why did she look at him like that? Why did she wave? Why did she run? Adrian's voice was quieter when he spoke again. "What's her name?" The gate man hesitated, then sighed. "Her name is Evelyn, Your Highness. But she's nobody important." Nobody important. Adrian wasn't sure why, but something about that statement made his heart ache. Evelyn. The name sat on Prince Adrian's tongue long after he had returned to the palace. He whispered it in the quiet of his chambers, rolling the syllables over as if trying to unlock some hidden meaning within them. Who was she? Why had she waved at him all those times, only to run when he finally approached? Why did it feel like she wasn't just a maid, like there was something more to her, something unseen? Adrian found himself staring at the high ceilings of his room that night, unable to sleep. His mother had always told him that a prince had no business thinking about commoners. But this wasn't about rank or status. It wasn't about logic. It was about the way his heart had clenched when he saw her disappear into the house, like a fleeting dream slipping through his fingers. He needed to see her again. But how? Would she even speak to him after running away? The next afternoon, under the pretense of an errand, Adrian found himself back at the Iron Gate. The mansion behind it was grand, though not as extravagant as the palace. It belonged to the wealthy Madame Beatrice, a woman known for her strict rules and her love for luxury. The maids who worked for her were little more than shadows in the background, moving quietly, avoiding eye contact. And yet, Evelyn had dared to wave. Adrian stepped out of his car, adjusting his royal blue coat, and approached the gate. The same elderly gateman was there, watching him with an expression that held both amusement and confusion. "Back again, Your Highness." Adrian exhaled, glancing at the compound. "Is she here?" The gateman smiled knowingly. "You mean Evelyn?" The prince nodded. The old man chuckled. "I thought so. A prince looking for a maid. I never thought I'd see the day." Adrian frowned, slightly irritated. "Is she here or not?" The gateman hesitated, then motioned for him to step closer. "She's inside. But listen, Your Highness, that girl. She's not used to attention. She's shy. Quiet. Life hasn't been kind to her. If you scare her, she'd never come out again." Adrian was silent for a moment, absorbing those words. Then he asked, "Can you help me talk to her?" The gateman sighed, rubbing his chin. "I suppose I can try, but no promises." Adrian nodded, stepping aside as the old man shuffled toward the house. He watched anxiously as the man disappeared through the back entrance. Minutes passed, stretching endlessly, until finally, a small figure emerged from the doorway. "Evelyn." She moved hesitantly, her hands gripping the sides of her simple cotton dress, her head lowered as she approached. Adrian's heart stilled. She was breathtaking in her simplicity. The gateman cleared his throat. "Evelyn, this is—" "I know who he is," she interrupted softly and shyly, her voice barely above a whisper. She lifted her gaze, and their eyes met. Adrian had faced thousands of people before. He had been greeted by dignitaries, bowed to by nobles, admired by countless women. Yet no gaze had ever unsettled him the way hers did. She wasn't in awe of him. She wasn't impressed. She was wary, afraid, and that made Adrian more determined than ever to make her stay. "Why did you wave at me?" The question came before he could stop it. Evelyn flinched slightly but didn't look away. "I don't know. That's not an answer." She exhaled, shifting on her feet. "I waved because I thought the cars were beautiful." Adrian narrowed his eyes. "That's it." She nodded quickly. Liar. There was more to it. He could feel it, but he didn't press her. Instead, he let a small smile touch his lips. "So, you like beautiful things?" She hesitated, then nodded. Adrian stepped closer. "Then why did you run away when I came to you?" She swallowed, her fingers tightening on the fabric of her dress. "Because you're a prince." Adrian frowned. "And?" She blinked at him as if he had just asked a ridiculous question. "And princes don't talk to maids." Something sharp twisted in Adrian's chest. He had always known that society placed barriers between people, rich and poor, royalty and commoners. But he had never really felt those barriers until he saw the way Evelyn shrank back, already convinced that she was unworthy of his attention. For the first time in his life, the title he carried, prince, felt more like a curse than a blessing. "I'm talking to you now," he said softly. Evelyn lowered her gaze again, as if she didn't know what to do with those words. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the distant sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves. Then, finally, she whispered, "You shouldn't." Adrian clenched his jaw. "And what if I want to?" Evelyn looked up at him, her lips parting slightly in surprise. For a long moment, they just stood there, two people from different worlds, staring at each other across the invisible line that society had drawn between them. And for the first time, Adrian had the overwhelming urge to cross it. Evelyn had always known her place. From the moment she was brought to Madame Beatrice's house as a maid, she understood the unspoken rules: speak only when spoken to. Keep your head down, never dream beyond your station. And yet, here was a prince, a real, breathing prince, standing in front of her, asking questions, refusing to leave. She gripped the sides of her dress tightly, her heart pounding. Why was he doing this? Why was he looking at her as if she were someone worth noticing? It felt dangerous. Evelyn had watched the luxurious cars pass by the mansion for months, wondering what life was like on the other side of the gate. It wasn't just about the cars, it was about everything they represented. Power, wealth, a world where people didn't go to bed hungry. A world where no one slapped you for making a mistake while serving tea. So, when the convoy passed each afternoon, she had waved not because she expected a response, but because, for a brief moment, it made her feel like she existed, like she wasn't invisible. But the prince had noticed. He had seen her, and that terrified her, because people like him didn't just see people like her. They passed by, they looked through, they never stopped, until now. A prince who wouldn't leave. Adrian studied the girl in front of him. There was something about her that was different from every woman he had ever met. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't trying to flatter him. She was simply terrified. And yet, despite her fear, there was a quiet strength in her. He wanted to know more. He wanted to understand why she waved at the passing cars each time she saw them. Why she ran when he approached. Why her name wouldn't leave his mind. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken thoughts. Then Evelyn did something unexpected. She lifted her chin and whispered, "You shouldn't be here." Adrian exhaled. Why not? She glanced at the mansion behind her. "Because if Madame Beatrice finds out, she'd punish me." His jaw tightened. "For what? For talking to you?" Adrian frowned. "That's ridiculous." Evelyn gave a small, sad smile. "That's life." Something about the way she said it, so resigned, so certain, made his chest ache. How many times had she been told she was nothing? How many times had she been reminded of her place, forced to believe she wasn't worthy of kindness? Adrian took a step closer. "What if I promise she won't punish you?" Evelyn let out a small, breathy laugh. "A prince can't make promises to a maid." Adrian's lips twitched. "Says who?" She shook her head, eyes filled with disbelief. "Why are you doing this?" He didn't have an answer. All he knew was that he wasn't ready to walk away. But finally he decided to leave when the maid sighted a figure that looked like her madam. Over the next few days, Adrian found reasons to return. Sometimes, he brought goodies for the gate man, pretending he needed a quiet place. Other times, he stood at the gate for no reason at all, waiting for her to appear. At first, Evelyn resisted. She kept her distance. She spoke in clipped sentences, always watching over her shoulder, afraid that someone would catch them. But Adrian was patient. He asked about her life, about her dreams, and slowly, hesitantly, she started to answer. She told him about the small village she grew up in. How she had once dreamed of being a teacher. How she had come to the city, hoping for something better, only to find herself trapped in a life of endless labor. She never complained. She never asked for pity. She simply told her story. And with every word, Adrian found himself sinking deeper. It didn't take long for whispers to reach the palace. Servants talked, gossip spread, and soon, Queen Margaret, Adrian's mother, heard the news. Her son, a prince, speaking to a maid, a common, an educated girl with no background, no title, no value to the royal family. The thought alone made her blood boil. She stormed into Adrian's chambers one evening, her silk gown flowing behind her like a storm cloud. "Is it true?" Adrian, sitting near the window with a book in his lap, barely glanced up. "Is what true, mother?" Her hands clenched at her sides. "Don't play games with me." "Is it true that you've been spending time with a maid?" Adrian closed his book slowly. "And if I have?" Queen Margaret inhaled sharply, as if his words physically hurt her. "You are a prince. You do not mix with people like her." Adrian leaned forward. "People like her. She is a nobody, Adrian." Something inside him snapped. "A nobody." He stood, voice rising. "She is a person. She is kind. She is smart. She is not your equal." The queen cut in sharply. Adrian's chest heaved. "I never said she was." "Then why are you wasting your time?" "Because I care about her." The words were out before he could stop them. Queen Margaret's expression turned cold. "This foolishness ends now." Adrian's eyes darkened. "And if it doesn't?" His mother exhaled, regaining her composure. "You are my son. You are the future king. And I will not allow you to throw away your future for some illiterate girl." Adrian's jaw tightened. "You think I care about titles, about royal blood? You should." Adrian shook his head, stepping past her. "Then maybe I was never meant to be king." His mother's voice turned icy. "You will regret this, Adrian." But he didn't turn back, because in that moment, he knew this wasn't just curiosity anymore. This was something deeper, and no amount of royal blood could change that. The tension in the royal palace grew heavier with each passing day. Queen Margaret could see it in the way Adrian moved, the way he barely spoke during dinner, how he spent long hours outside the palace, and most of all, The way he avoided her. Her son had never defied her before. Not like this. But now, because of a mere maid, he was slipping away from the life he was born into, the destiny he was meant to fulfill. She couldn't let that happen. So, she made a decision. If Adrian refused to see reason, then she would take matters into her own hands. Then one day the queen asked Adrian to invite the maid over. It wasn't an easy task for the maid to follow him. When they reached to the palace, the queen scanned the maid from head to toes. She didn't show any expression. The maid was terrified, afraid, but the queen said nothing. That night the queen made it clear to the prince that he wasn't going to marry that girl. She has that finality in her voice. The prince, after staring at his mother, gave out a derisive smile and left without uttering a word. When he left, the queen nodded her head. She knew what exactly to do and she must do it fast. Late one evening, long after the palace halls had fallen silent, Queen Margaret called for Madame Beatrice, the wealthy woman who owned the mansion where Evelyn worked. The older woman arrived dressed in an elegant silk gown, her face powdered and refined, though her eyes gleamed with curiosity. "Your Majesty," she greeted, lowering into a deep curtsy. Queen Margaret studied her for a moment before speaking. "I assume you are aware of the girl named Evelyn who works in your household." Madame Beatrice's expression stiffened. "Yes, Your Majesty." The queen's lips curled into a cold smile. "And I assume you are also aware that my son has taken an interest in her." Madame Beatrice let out a nervous chuckle. Yes. It has been quite the talk among the servants." Queen Margaret's gaze darkened. "Then you understand why this cannot continue." A heavy silence settled between them. Madame Beatrice was no fool. She knew that going against the queen could cost her everything, but she also knew that if she played her cards right, she could win favor with the royal family. "Your Majesty, I assure you, I never encouraged any form of relationship between them," she said carefully. "But what would you have me do?" The queen's fingers traced the rim of her teacup. "Send her away," she said simply. Madame Beatrice blinked. "Send her away, back to her village, immediately." Madame Beatrice hesitated. "If I do that, what if the prince?" "The prince will have no choice but to forget her," the queen interrupted, her voice laced with finality. "And if you do this for me, Madame Beatrice, you will be rewarded handsomely." That was all the incentive she needed. With a slow nod, Madame Beatrice smiled. "Consider it done, Your Majesty." And just like that, Evelyn's fate was sealed. Evelyn was scrubbing the kitchen floor when Madame Beatrice's voice rang through the house. "Pack your things." Evelyn froze, her hands still submerged in the soapy water. She turned slowly, confusion washing over her. Madame Beatrice's expression was unreadable. "I said pack your things. You are leaving." Evelyn's heart pounded. "Leaving? To where?" "Back to your village, of course. Where else would a girl like you go?" The words struck like a slap. Evelyn's throat tightened. "But why?" Madame Beatrice sighed as if bored by the conversation. "Your services are no longer needed. That's all you need to know." A lump formed in Evelyn's throat. No warning, no explanation. Just like that, she was being discarded. She thought of Adrian, the way he had come back every day, the way he had looked at her as if she mattered. Had she done something wrong? Had she offended someone? The weight of helplessness pressed against her chest, but she knew better than to argue. So, without another word, she wiped her hands on her apron, stood up, and walked to her tiny corner of the servants' quarters to gather her things. She had no choice. She was going home. Prince Adrian stood at the grand iron gate of the mansion, his heart pounding in frustration. His fists clenched at his sides as he stared at the gatekeeper, an elderly man with graying hair and tired eyes. The man shifted uncomfortably under the prince's intense gaze. "Where is she?" Adrian demanded, his voice sharp with desperation. The gatekeeper, Mr. Patrick, sighed and shook his head. "Your Highness, I cannot tell you." Hello champions, I hope you enjoyed our stories. Please hit the like button, leave a comment below and subscribe to our channel. Thanks.